NRCS. I am sorry I couldn't join you all tonight. I'm getting a slight echo. Sorry, I'm hesitating. I think it's fixed now. I'm sorry I couldn't join you all in person tonight. I'm based in the Mid-Atlantic area, so Philadelphia, New Jersey region, where I've been for about a year in this position. And prior to that, I was doing my graduate work at Cornell in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York, and I also grew up in upstate New York. So I've tried to pull in some Maine specific information here, but a lot of this will be more broadly Northeast. So I think I'll just get started. I'm aiming for about 30 minutes, but I'll try and be speedier since I know we're starting a couple minutes late. All right. So my talk is called Pollinators in the Forest, some surprising ways that pollinators depend on the woods. And just to get us started, the Xerces Society, the nonprofit for which I work, is motivated by this idea that the fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own. Even if you don't really like bugs, we do really rely on them very strongly for things like soil health, pest control, crop yields, as the base of a food chain for so many beloved birds and other mammals. And then, of course, I'm a member of the pollinator conservation team. And so I think a lot about how much of our food and so many of the plants that we love depend on pollination. All right, just interrupt me if anything's going on, or I'll just keep going. So the Xerces Society works in a lot of different ways in order to help conserve these invertebrates. I'm on the pollinator team. We have folks who specialize in conservation biocontrol, in IPM, in pesticide management and protection, in community science initiatives, and certification programs for both cities and campuses. Lots of different ways to get involved. And we are a member mute. All right, I'm now unmuted again. If you are a Xerces member, thank you so much. And if you are interested in this presentation today, we'd be very honored to have you join as a member. All right, so today's talk, I wanted to give a kind of a big intro to how bees fit into our broader pollination and diversity story for insects. Then zoom in to kind of this unexpected piece of ways bees relate to the woods, and that'll be the majority of the presentation. So we'll talk about open areas, gaps, including harvests first, and then move into spring ephemerals, ways that pollinators may use forests as nesting habitat, and then move up to the canopy. And kind of tie it all together with a really brief forest health thought before handing off to the next presenter. So first, intro to bee diversity. We know that bees are only one of our major groups of pollinators, although they are the one I'm going to focus on today, but beetles, moths, hoverflies like this bee mimic up here, beetles, birds, lizards are all great pollinators for different systems. And our beloved European honeybee, the first bee I ever fell in love with, is actually from Europe and came starting in the 1600s to the US. And I really think that it's helpful to think of beekeeping as an agricultural pursuit. I love agriculture, but keeping bees is more like keeping chickens or other livestock in that they need careful management and did not actually co-evolve with our plants here, and so need to be managed responsibly. And that's not the topic of today's talk, but I did want to point you towards this really fantastic, careful, thoughtful webinar by my colleague, Rich Hatfield, called We Need to Talk About Honeybees. If you're interested, it's on our YouTube channel, kind of thinking about all the dynamics of the ways honeybees and our wild bees interact. And so if we're not just talking about honeybees, then what am I talking about? And the way that I like to define bees is as the fuzzy vegetarian cousins of wasps. So a long, long time ago, some wasps who were catching some insects on flowers, I like to kind of tell it like this story. They realized, hang on, next to all these other insects that I'm catching on flowers, there's also this protein-rich pollen that I could just collect instead. So, I have this picture here of a wasp who's bringing home a spider to paralyze and rear its young on. Lots of other spiders are carnivorous. Wasps are carnivorous. But bees became fuzzy over time to help them carry the pollen back to their nests. And there's actually lots of different protein levels in different pollens, but pollen can have up to 61% protein in a single pollen grain. So that's a really great way to rear a baby bee. So that's where fuzzy vegetarian wasp comes from. And all these different bees evolved incredible diversity of shapes and sizes. They're active at different times of year, and many of them have certain flowers that they really prefer or even must interact with in order to reproduce. And we have actually over 20,000 species of wild bees worldwide and over 5,000 in North America, and probably around 600 to 700 in the broader northeast of the US. And because they don't nest in hives, there's lots of different nesting biology, including cavity nesting, like bumblebees who do have social colonies during the summer. Soil nesting, a lot of these are solitary bees. Each one of these is like a single apartment building for one female bee. And then lots of stem and wood nesting, and we'll talk more about that when we get into forest nesting shortly. And just for a little bit of life cycle intuition to help you understand these different relationships, this is an example of a solitary bee, which is 70% of our wild bees are solitary. And this example, this bee was overwintering underground, and then in the spring, the males and the females emerge, and they're active just for a couple weeks. During that period, they're going back and forth from their nest, which in this case is a soil-dwelling bee, to the flowers, getting pollen, bringing it back to their nest, and making a big ball of pollen. The female does this with a bunch of different nests, and then she dies. And those eggs hatch, and the larvae and then the pupae wait out all the way till the next year, when they then become an adult and don't emerge till the next season. And of course, there's not only bees active in April and May, but many of our solitary bees have these short life cycles. Others will come out in May, others will come out in June, others come out in August and only visit goldenrods and asters. And then, of course, bees like bumblebees are out all year. And so I would draw the line kind of for the whole season here. But many of our solitary bees have these really short life cycles of adulthood. And so I'm going to start throwing up some management implications here on the right. And so this simple one, although it can be hard to get done in practice, is just to protect floral and nesting resources all year long. So if you know there's a soil nesting aggregation, you may not see them all through the winter, but they're under the soil surface waiting to come out next year. All right, so that's our kind of our background on biology, but now let's get into the woods. And a lot of this research is pretty new on bees in the forest, and it was motivated after kind of the news of honeybee decline hit the news in the late 2000s, 2007, 2008. And then bee researchers started saying, whoa, like how can we make sure we have wild free living pollinators who can also support our crops, even if we're having trouble with honeybees? And so all this research started, and people started finding that in agricultural systems, when there was more forest nearby, there was often a healthier bee population in that crop. So this looked like a bunch of different things. Some people found that when there was more forest just in the landscape, there were more bees in the fields. Others looked within an orchard row itself in apple orchards. This particular work was done, and they would find that as you got closer to the woods, even down a single row, you'd find more species diversity. Sometimes this, especially in strawberry and apple, having forests and hedgerows nearby has been associated with higher fruit quality. And then we also know that pollinator populations are heavily impacted by insecticides and fungicides, and that forests and hedgerows nearby can help buffer the negative effects on pollinator populations when there's natural habitat, including forests nearby. And this has been found around the world in a lot of different systems. There's, of course, variability region to region, but this is kind of a bigger pattern that people have started to pick up on in the last 10 years or so. And because bees can't go very far from their nests, right? We think about that female bee I showed you who has to make this giant ball of pollen. It can take up to 30 visits to a flower to make enough ball of pollen for a single baby bee for next year. That's a lot of trips. They need their resources nearby their nests. They can't just meander across the landscape looking for food. So we think about needing to keep those resources nearby. And so if we see more bees near forests, that makes us ask why. So that's kind of the motivation for how we started looking in the woods more often. And this is in contrast to our kind of conventional wisdom for how to think about bees, because a lot of the great work that a lot of folks are doing includes meadows, gardens, wildflower strips, and that is all absolutely true. Bees definitely need those resources, and they definitely do love coming to flowers in the sunshine. So here's this picture here I'm going to come back to. You know, our kind of conventional wisdom for bees in the woods is that they're only in sunny gaps. And I'm going to say they're definitely in sunny gaps and we need those, but they're also doing other things in the woods that are more surprising. So just to kind of sit with that for a moment, this kind of edge space that's sunnier, we think a lot about road berms, we think a lot about edges and gaps. Some other examples are recent harvests, thinned forests, prescribed, and wildfire. We know that different fire intensities can lead to different communities of bees across a landscape. Log landings and skid trails, post-windfall, post-storm gaps, soft or scalloped edges, so kind of having a more gradual transition between a forest and a field or other cleared area can create niches for lots of different habitat. And as long as these areas are not invaded by non-native species or smothered out in some way, these are absolutely really great places for bees to be found on flowers. For example, a recent harvest will often have a flush of herbaceous and brambly and shrubby flowers in the first couple years before regeneration of the pole stage of trees kind of comes in and makes that denser and less sunny. Some research here has found that as a stand gets older in the years since harvest, the floral age decreases. So, you know, in an actively managed forest, this may look like that flush of flowers is most abundant right in those first couple years. Okay, so that's kind of our conventional wisdom of where we find bees in the woods, and it's absolutely true. And so along those lines, our implication here is managed for diverse native species in gaps, edges, and early successional habitat. But we also know that there's lots of mature forest, right? Forests have always been disturbed. There's long histories of indigenous management, fire, blowdowns, gaps, but there's always been a lot of mature forest also. And so we have all these native free-living bees who've evolved with the forest. And indeed, some interesting new research has shown that up to a third of the 118 bees that this particular group was able to look at found that about 32% of those bees were pretty much entirely forest associated. The more mature forest there was nearby, the more of that group of bees there was, that subset of bees. And then they found that another third of the bees needed forest for at least part of their lives and then would go out of the forest for other parts of their lives. With the remaining third kind of not needing the forest at all and being more like our open area species. And so this brings me to this other part of this figure, which is, okay, so what are those relationships with the mature forest looking like? And so we'll talk about spring ephemerals, and then nesting, and then we'll go to the canopy. All right, I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. One study that focused on our only endangered bumblebee, the rusty-patched bumblebee, they looked across time and they looked at life stages, and they found that during this critical activity period for queens, which is when the bumblebees are founding their nests during the beginning of the season, the majority of the food plants they used were in the forest. And they used historical data sets and found that there was a decline in the abundance of bumblebee forage plants in forest understories, which their analysis suggested provided the primary nectar and pollen resources for the queens who were founding nests in spring, a critical life stage, right? And then you see that later life stages used other habitats, but this forest spring ephemeral community was crucial for that early spring founding period when the colonies get started. So that's bumblebees. We also have a lot of specialist bees that will rely only on spring ephemerals. So now that we know that there's some solitary bees who are only out for a couple of weeks, then specialization makes sense, right? Because if you're only out for a couple of weeks, it may make sense to say, hey, I'm only out for a couple of weeks in April, and there's always this beautiful flower blooming for the whole time that I'm an adult. And then if they get really good at using that resource, then they are really efficient. Their larvae can adapt to using that pollen really perfectly for their development. And so here's one of my favorite examples. Down here, it's usually Claytonia virginiana, but I think you guys have Claytonia caroliniana up in Maine. And this bee, Andrena erigine, can only eat Claytonia pollen, can only rear its young on Claytonia pollen. Spring beauty. This is another one I really love. This geranium or cranesbill specialist, Andrena distans, only raises its babies on geranium pollen. You can see here it being the fuzzy hairs that hold the pollen that it's bringing back to its nest. These are all solitary soil nesters, really gentle solitary bees. There's a trout lily mining bee, and these have some really cool kleptoparasites who will drink the nectar of the same plant. And there's lots of other specialist spring ephemerals that host specialists, including violets, uvularia, and there's some resources that are made for upstate New York, but probably widely work in Maine for thinking about which species of plants you may have that support specialists, meaning if that plant is gone, that insect will also be gone. And so protect spring ephemerals is a management implication. And I just wanted to highlight a couple studies that showed that in heavily invaded forests, this is really common where I live, you get these dense thickets of invasive honeysuckle and privet and lots of other species. And this study looked, and after they removed this invasive honeysuckle, they found that the pollination services were restored to the spring ephemeral geranium. Similarly, this was some work down, I think in Georgia, it was definitely in the southeast, where they had privet kind of smothering out the full understory. They were seeing low forest regeneration as well as really low pollinator diversity. And they were able to follow these plots after privet removal for 13 years and found that the bee community became diverse and abundant once again, and they started seeing tree regeneration. So I think we're used to thinking about this, especially if there's foresters in the audience with regards to tree regen, but we don't always connect that link up to the species that rely on those flowers. All right, so nesting. This was another study that looked from an agricultural perspective. This one's based in Michigan, and these guys put out these traps where you basically put a little tent on the ground and see if any bee comes up into it. And they were working in the spring, and they found that the majority of the bees that, or the largest number of different kinds of bees that came out in the spring were from the woods. This declined in the summertime. It became more abundance in the flowers and in the crop. But in the early springtime, it was a really active period in the forest. We also talked about bumblebees. Some bumblebees really relying on spring ephemerals in the forest floor, but lots of bumblebee queens will also found their nests in abandoned rodent burrows or under rotting logs or in the duff layer of leaves on the forest floor. This was in April. The forest looked real empty, but the bumblebee queens had already come out and were busily looking for a place to start their nests. And here's just a summary of ways that some bumblebees use forests. Again, some bumblebees really need forests, others need open spaces also, spring flowers, and then founding their colonies. Then the colony is busy over the whole summer, but by the end of the winter, only next year's queens are still alive. Different than honeybee biology. And the queens are looking for a place to overwinter. And then many of these queens, I kind of think of them like big black bears. They've stocked up on food and they're ready to hibernate all winter long. They go nestling around looking for a place to overwinter just a couple inches below the leaf or the needle duff layer. And that's where they'll stay till they come out in the spring. So protect duff, leaf litter, abandoned rodent burrows, well-drained slopes seem to be a really preferred place for nesting. And we do need a lot more research on these kinds of details because a lot of this is pretty new that we're realizing how much of this happens in the woods. One of my favorite groups of bees that nests in the woods nests in snags, in coarsewoody debris, and dead wood of kind of a less decayed decay class, I guess, like a 1 or a 2, if you're thinking in decay classes. And so they will use beetle burrows, and go crawl inside them and then make those same kind of pollen balls that they lay eggs on top of inside the wood. And I actually did some tree climbing during my research, and I found even in big old dead branches on otherwise healthy trees, there would sometimes be these shiny green bee nesting aggregations nesting in a dead branch. I see them in stumps and snags, even in park benches, but they are of a forest-associated bee. Another cool interaction, I've seen soil nesting bees. So here's a tip up and in the soil suspended in those roots. This was similarly a sunny day in April. I found this aggregation of sweat bees. They're pretty hard to see, but you can sometimes catch them glinting in the sun here. And they were all nesting in this kind of well-drained, probably free from predators, nice sunny spot where all these bees, now maybe you can see them, we're in and out of this soil suspended in the roots. And there's other folks who found this for some cool tunnel nesting bees who use the soil to build these kind of chimneys that they go in and out of to get to their burrows. All right, and so that's all bees. The ones that I know of all use those kind of less decayed, more intact logs, but a lot of our other really important decomposers and also flower flies and a bunch of other flies that are the base of the food chain rely on more decay classes, so kind of softer logs. So we need kind of multiple ages of downed and deadwood in order to support our full invertebrate biodiversity. And I was reading some things in the Maine forests summary and found that there's amazing stats, like there's 373 million standing dead trees of at least 5 inches in DBH across all of Maine. But really interestingly, they said that more than 85% of those standing dead trees were less than 11 inches diameter at breast height, and suggested that they suggested in that report that there may be limited availability of large standing deadwood, and I think that that might extrapolate to invertebrates. Again, I'm not an expert in Maine, so I'll let other people weigh in on that, but that was a really interesting statistic. All right, and then while we're thinking of other ways that animals nest or rely for their larvae on trees, if you've heard of the research of Doug Tallamy, then I'm just preaching to the choir here, but this is a lot of this same really careful research looking at native trees and how many different caterpillars they support. So this is the Mid-Atlantic region, but these stats are pretty much the same idea no matter where you go. So like on oak, there's over 500 species of caterpillar that rely on oak trees. And again, even if you think you hate caterpillars, they are the food that our birds need, and we know that our birds are struggling. Cherry 450, willow 450, birch over 400, poplar 360, acer almost 300, and down the line, right? I'm just highlighting some trees. So of course, forest types vary enormously by region, by soil type, by land use history, but we do want to think about tree diversity as is appropriate for your site and ecosystem in order to support that diversity of invertebrates who rely on them. And a lot of these are specialized, meaning, again, they won't be able to switch hosts. There's some sort of biological barrier where they don't know how to recognize it, or they aren't adapted to digest that plant material. And so they need that host plant in order to keep living. All right, so finally, all right, I'm going to try and be done within 10 minutes because I know we started about 10 minutes late. So, okay, cool. Thanks for bearing with me, everyone. So the last part is the canopy here. So what's going on in the canopy? That's my favorite part of the story. Some of these are some really fun ones that people have just scratched the surface, but we're pretty sure there's something cool going on there. If you've heard of honeydew, that's kind of this sugary excretion that scale insects and aphids and others kind of sap-sucking insects will excrete after they've extracted what they want from the plant sugar, from the plant phloem. And then there's bees that have figured out that when those insects are excreting that sugary honeydew, they can actually use that in place of nectar. There's places in Turkey and Greece where the beekeepers actually manage their European honeybees to go be specifically where that honeydew is being produced in high volumes and the honeydew honey is in high demand. But there's a lot of really interesting stories, especially in conifer forests, a lot in the Adirondacks, where bumblebees have been found. Basically, one or two really intense researchers keep documenting this and nobody else is looking for it, where there's aggregations of bumblebees actually drinking honeydew in drought years when there may be less nectar on the landscape. So that's a cool interaction. This is also pretty poorly studied, but there's in the family that has honeybees and bumblebees and carpenter bees in it, as well as the leafcutter and mason bees, there's evidence that when they're challenged by some gut pathogens, they'll go seeking out resins and saps and the kind of sticky resins from cottonwood buds and bring them back to their nests. They use this both for weatherproofing and we think also potentially for some antimicrobial benefits. So that's pretty cool. Really tall trees are often preferred mating sites. And then just like we think about for deer or other mammals or birds, a lot of times we think about some dense stands, but even just any forest itself, maybe in a big agricultural landscape, provides wind shelter, a transit corridor, and microclimate temperature moderation. So those are some cool uses of canopy resources. But the biggest one, and one that we really have a lot of solid evidence for, is nectar and pollen produced by flowers in the canopy. And I like to think of each blooming tree as a temporary meadow in the sky. A lot of trees will only bloom for a couple days or a week or two, but during that time, the amount of pollen and nectar it's producing is almost unbelievable. And these are pretty well known for the insect pollinated trees. A lot of beekeepers really rely and they look out for when the maple starts blooming in early spring. Maple's kind of wind, kind of insect pollinated, but willow, cherry, Nyssa, tulip tree, locust, lots of other fruit producing trees were really well-known pollen and nectar resources. Here's actually, this is striped maple that I have this little video of. This was in a recent shelterwood harvest, and I hardly ever see striped maple flowers in the sun, but in this case it was in the sun, and I found this gentle solitary mining bees, both foraging and mating on these flowers. So that was pretty cool. So that's a maple. And then I would be remiss not to mention the lost chestnut bee. There's more and more interest in the pollinators and the other insects that may have really enormously relied on the just astronomical amount of resource that chestnuts would have produced before chestnut blight. And it looks like there are some of these specialists have lasted on chinkapin, on hybrids, on the rare American chestnut. And when I've been able to go visit some chestnuts in bloom, they are just alive with insects. And this particular specialist called Andrina Rainey, the quote unquote lost chestnut bee, has recently been found in a couple more locations. So if you have chestnuts and you're interested in getting involved, I could try and connect you to the folks looking for that cool specialist bee. But this is all part of the same theme of the amount of resources produced in the canopy by blooming trees. The amount of nectar is huge. I've said that over and over now. The few people who've quantified it have found some really interesting stats, like a single red maple tree can have 600 nectar producing flowers in a single cubic meter of canopy, kind of a weird way to think about a tree, or over 1,300 pollen making flowers, right? Flowers can have nectar or pollen or both. Depending on the species. And I actually spent a long time during graduate school trying to estimate the number of pollen grains produced by sugar maple trees, because I kept finding bees on sugar maple flowers. And we found that this is not a made up number. 100 billion grains of pollen is the average number of pollen grains made by a single sugar maple. Now, the only other people who've tried to count that are the allergists, and they agree with those estimates, but I almost never want to remind people about that part of it. And oak trees make even more, hickory makes even more. And so one question that we had was, in addition to all those insect pollinated trees that they absolutely visit, are they also visiting wind pollinated trees? So part of my dissertation research, I had some awesome assistants, and this is me climbing up with my butterfly net dangling behind me up into a canopy tree. It's a time lapse, of course. And we looked at bees visiting mostly maples and oaks in the early spring. And then we also put up a bunch of traps with pulley systems, because you can only physically be in so many trees at once, right? And you want to have replicated data to understand if it's a bigger pattern. So I also used kind of pulley systems and giant slingshots to get these traps up, and looked at which bees I caught over the whole spring and to figure out which pollens they were eating. Then we opened up the digestive tracts of all the bees that we caught and identified thousands and thousands of pollen grains to think about to learn more about what they might have been doing up there, right? Because we had observations while with the net, but then the traps only told us the bee was there, so we needed to look at the pollen to see what was that bee doing. And we were also working in adjacent apple orchards. And in that research, I'm just going to do a really brief summary. I could talk about this for ages, but basically we found that canopy pollen, especially maple and oak, were a hugely important part of the spring diet. And this was true across most of the 90 species that we caught in this study. And then there were some species and some individuals that also had eaten some beech, had eaten some birch, some green bees really like walnut. Emerald ash borer had already kind of shot through, so there was hardly any ash, but I did find some bees had eaten almost 100% ash pollen on some trees that clearly were still out there. So I'm wondering if ash used to be a bigger part of spring diets. We needed to sample in the canopy in order to really get a sense of how serious this was. I have canopy pollen in yellow here, and the bees caught in the understory on the left, and the bees caught in the canopy on the right. And you can see that the bees caught in the canopy had eaten more pollen overall, and had also eaten more of this yellow pollen, right? That's just bees on the right were the ones caught in the canopy across time. They had eaten a lot of yellow pollen. That's all the pollen from the canopy. Yeah, and I also found that there were a lot of male bees of important orchard pollinators who never came out of the woods. So they also may be an important part of their life cycle, was having those male bees of pollinators that we then want the females in the orchard. The males were busy in the forest. And so there's lots of different takeaways from this, like consider the whole life cycle. But again, I'm just going to highlight, manage for tree diversity, because we found that a lot of different trees were being used. There were not a lot of, I know that spruce fir forests and hemlock are really important in Maine. We don't think that those are very good pollen resources. I didn't find a lot of it, but I also was not sampling in conifer forests. But we don't see those pollens show up very often in other people's research either. So we think that the ways that they're using those trees is likely less pollen related than with these hardwoods, even though some of them are wind pollinated. And one thing I just want to emphasize really formally as I wrap up here is that a lot of these interactions are in the springtime. So this is just another graph I'm showing. Green is, bees in the forest in the spring, and then that abundance really declines later in the season. Some of that has to do with those specialists who are only out for a couple of weeks. I think a lot of it also has to do with that being when the canopy trees for many species bloom in the spring. And so a lot of that activity is over later in the summer. And in my research, we found that a lot of those bees that were active in the woods then showed up in the orchard a few weeks later. And so they kind of got their start in the woods. That kept them a reason to stick around. It gave them food to eat before the orchard started blooming. And then once the orchard started blooming, a lot of them were really happy to say, okay, cool, now there's rosaceous pollen in these orchards over here. I'll go pollinate these orchard trees. And so the habitats were really complementary. And lots of other papers have shown similar patterns. And so again, forest-dependent pollinators can spill over into neighboring habitats, but the distance they can go varies between species and body size and sociality. All right, so just to summarize, different bees need different amounts of forest. There's forest-associated insects. This is just one figure that's focused on bumblebees. There's habitat generalists who like both forests and then also need open habitats. And then there's open habitat-associated bumblebees and other bees who basically don't ever go into the woods and don't need it. And so there's kind of a rule of thumb. I think, because Maine is 89% forest, I don't think this rule of thumb is really what you need to worry about, except maybe in highly fragmented areas that are more urbanized. But across the Northeast, generally, we're starting to think, and across the world, generally, if you're in a really diverse landscape that's not predominantly forest, you want to try to think about at least 15 to 30% forest, whether that's hedgerow, riparian buffers, small woodlots, in order to keep that forest-associated population healthy. All right, so here's my summary, just to help us remember all the things we talked about today. What was going on in the woods? We have nesting and overwintering on the forest floor. We have pollen and nectar collection from spring ephemerals. We have nesting in snags, stumps, deadwood, and the soil and tip-ups. And then pollen collection, not just from insect-pollinated canopy trees, but even from some wind-pollinated canopy trees. Oops. And there's the same summary. Diverse landscapes with all these different pieces are important in order to support all our bees. And so the kind of final thought is just, I think that the goal with pollinator habitat in the forest is not to try to convert forest habitat, land that's trying to be a forest, that's always been a forest, into a meadow, but rather to think about wildlife-friendly management that considers a healthy forest into the long term in order to support all of these different elements, which over time will support that broad diversity of bees. And I just wanted to highlight that there's lots of different recommendations. Bee people are kind of catching up to the birds and catching up to the other wildlife folks, because this is kind of new since colony collapse disorder, so-called, hit the news in late 2000s. We're only really catching up on the conservation of all these wild species. But I think luckily in the meantime, there's a lot of really great recommendations out there for kind of healthy, climate resilient, climate adaptive forest management that I think will be really synergistic with the best management practices for pollinators as we formalize those details. And tons of forest is privately owned in the Northeast, so you can make a difference. And that is the end. We have a ton of wild bees. They all need different things. Forests have always changed. And I realize this is a different introduction, I'm sorry, a different structure, but I think that if we want to be thinking about healthy pollinator communities in the woods, we want to think about healthy forests. And with that in mind, I have gone over time, but I will stop now and hand it off. And I'm happy to stick around after to chat. So thanks for having me.
Are we allowed to ask questions?
I can't hear the main room. I'm going to let them decide when question time is, but I would love to chat when it's time for sure. I can't hear you, Casey. All
right, can you hear me now?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
Let's take a couple minutes and ask some questions while we get set up for the next presentation.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Yes, I think
Kent? Yeah, I'll jump in here and ask two questions, really. One is, how would you characterize the benefit of invertebrates to the forest health? And the second question is, is there a conflict between wild bees and European bees?
Yeah, two great questions. Thanks. So the first question was kind of just flipping the script a little, not just how bees use forests, but also how are pollinators and invertebrates important to the forest. So I think some of those things like being really crucial parts of the food chain. So we know that we need invertebrates for healthy soil structures, for decomposition, so kind of all of our nutrient cycling. Also, caterpillars and a lot of other invertebrates are the base of the food chain for a lot of our other mammals and birds. So all those other wildlife benefits. There's also, when we think about insects in forests, we often think about, these very real problems, which are pest insects, spruce budworm, emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, right? But those are actually like a very, very small percentage, and most of them are new arrivals. But if we got rid of all the insects, we would basically have no more pollination services, no more food for all of the other. So that percentage is really, really tiny. But worth noting. And then of course, a lot of the, solutions for those can include things like biological controls, which may be other insects. If done very carefully, that's also a really complicated issue. Yeah, and then there is increasing evidence that honeybees and wild bees are not just competing for resources, especially in large apiaries. This may not be the case on the scale of a small backyard beekeeper. but there's also increasing evidence. We used to think, well, we don't know, the background amount of viruses in wild bees. Maybe they're all sharing equally, but there's a bunch of new, really compelling, unfortunately, it's sad research, right, that shows that when you have a large apiary in one place, there is a higher proportion of honeybee diseases in bumblebees and other bees nearby. And as you get farther away from those apiaries, those honeybee diseases are no longer a big problem in those wild bees. So careful disease management and lots of forage if you're going to have honeybees is, lots of different crops still rely on them for sure. So it's a complicated issue, but I definitely direct you to that YouTube video from Rich Hatfield, where he kind of walks through all these things. And he also loves honeybees, right? Like they were also the first bee I ever loved. It's, he comes at it with a lot of care, and as someone who really cares about beekeepers and honeybees, but really trying to think about striking that balance. I see a hand from Jake Meyer. Is that right?
I just wanted to say that the chat is not on for everybody. It says chat only for members. So that might affect other people too. So the only way to say something is to speak up. And I also wanted to say that was a fantastic presentation.
Oh, thank you so much.
I really enjoyed it. It was great.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad. Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you all. I don't think I have control over the chat settings, but thank you. Yeah, and anybody else who is interested.
Yeah, and we're sorry about the chat. We're not sure, but we'll just go with the hand raising and speak up when people have questions, and we'll handle it that way. If that works. So
and it looks like the next presentation is up, so.
Yeah, so we'll do more questions at the end, but for now, I think we'll pop into the next presenter and we'll go from there.
Yeah, because the mic is.
All right, so I'm going to have Jeremy take it away.
Great, great to be here. So I'm Jeremy Markuson, and I work for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And those of you who might not know NRCS, we are an federal agency under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we were previously known as the Soil Conservation Service up until the mid-1990s, and then we became NRCS. We have a broad range of different disciplines and staff, from biologists like myself to agronomists, soil scientists, geologists, foresters, and even engineers as well. Our focus is private land. So we primarily work with private landowners. Here in Maine, it's a lot of woodlot owners, as well as your typical agricultural producers as well. We're non-regulatory, so all of the programs we offer, which can be financial assistance or technical assistance, which basically means coming out and assisting without any federal funding, is voluntary. None of it is regulatory at all. And then our legislative authorities come from Farm Bill. So that's who we are. So today, if I can switch the slide. It's right here. There we go.
There you go.
That working?
Will it flip through now, or
I can try it. There it goes. Okay. Maybe I wasn't pressing hard enough. Well, today I'm going to talk about a collaborative partnership between NRCS and other partners. It's called the New England Pollinator Partnership. And if you're familiar with NRCS and what we typically refer as to working lands for wildlife, it follows the same framework and model. Basically, the effort is to try to improve the habitat conditions for rare species. It's a long-term agreement, and it's working with private landowners to focus on pollinator conservation efforts. Some of our partners, as I mentioned before, is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation that Kass represents, the Wild Blueberry Commission of Maine, University of Maine, and then also recently University of Rhode Island, as well as others, private landowners across 6 states. So the effort involves all of New England, so Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And when we first developed this back in 2009, we focused on some priority areas. Here in Maine, there are 2 top priority areas. Those on the coast where the last occurrences of the federally listed rusty patch bumblebee was observed. And then other states also focused on areas too where there was known occurrences of rare bees. So the species that we're focusing on this agreement are 3 primary ones: the rusty patch bumblebee, which is federally endangered, the yellow-banded bumblebee, and then the monarch butterfly. But that's not all. So we wanted to also tackle some other bumblebee species that are really in decline, not just in Maine, but also across New England. And they include the American bumblebee, which was recently petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act, the yellow bumblebee, the confusing bumblebee, the lemon cuckoo bumblebee, the Fernald's cuckoo bumblebee, indiscriminate cuckoo bumblebee, Ashton's cuckoo bumblebee, and then lastly, the variable cuckoo bumblebee. So in May, we know that all these bees are extant, or they occur within Maine, except for 3 haven't been observed recently. And that is rusty patch bumblebee, which last observed in 2009, as well as American bumblebee. Has been a long time since that was observed. And then indiscriminate bumblebee was, cuckoo bumblebee hasn't been observed in a long time. But all of these bees are rare, declining within New England and in Maine. So part of the effort, we work with private landowners to basically do pollinator conservation work. And there's 4 basic criteria that's involved. One is that you complete one of our conservation practices, one of the core practices that is used to improve pollinator habitat. 2, a wildlife habitat evaluation guide is completed. Usually this is by a conservation planner from one of our field offices, or it could be from Xerces Society. We have a partner biologist that will be hired soon in the future. Best management practices are implemented. A lot of these BMPs involve avoiding the detrimental impacts to pollinator habitats, such as establishing buffers around areas where wildflowers have been established from pesticide applications, and then maintaining the practice. So we have some outreach material. We used to have a website. It went down. We're going to get that back up. And then I also have some outreach material here about kind of the framework for this effort. We provide financial assistance. So if you were to apply, there is financial assistance for those who are interested in improving their woodlots as well as their croplands for pollinator conservation purposes. One other piece I'll mention about the New England Pollinator Partnership is that there's this peace of mind, what I refer to as regulatory predictability. So a lot of these bees might be listed within the future under the Endangered Species Act. So if there's an entity or an individual that's nervous about creating habitat for rare bees that might be listed under the Endangered Species Act, we have this agreement partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that if you're following your conservation plan that's developed with NRCS, you won't be at risk of an Endangered Species Act violation, harm, harassment over one of these bees or monarch butterfly if it gets listed. So by 2025, all the states within New England agreed to trying to create habitat as well as work with private landowners, producers to do pollinator conservation work. Here in Maine, by 2025, we want to create at least 2,400 acres of habitat or improve on habitat. We want to work with over 400 producers and then also implement integrated pest and pollinator management, basically in an effort to avoid, minimize impacts to native bees from pesticide applications. So now I'll go into some of these practices that we're utilizing under this effort. The first one frequently used. It's called early successional habitat development and management. This is a picture here, actually in Piscataquis County, showing a patch cut. So as you would imagine, patch cut, you're coming in with forestry equipment and you're removing the forest, making a patch. Doesn't have to be really big. This photograph was taken in the fall, and you can just see the number of flowering plants that are established here, goldenrods and other flowering herbaceous vegetation that's coming up. That's one example. I think Kass showed this photo earlier. This is an example of a way you can use this practice to create what's called a feathered edge. So think of it as a gradual transition from, say, a crop field into the mature forest. And you do some thinning activities right against that mature forest and crop field to create a feathered edge, which can encourage flowering plants from establishing, which might be not only great for your floral, the nectar, pollen resources, but also could be opportunities for bees to nest in those areas as well. This is a photo of an old field. We have a lot of old fields in Maine, and the intent here is to prevent a lot of succession. So you're creating a place similar to like the patch cut, where it's a lot of flowering plants that are established, and you're minimizing the amount of forest regrowth, young forest that's establishing within an area. You can see a lot of milkweed, the goldenrods, other flowering plants throughout the season get established in these places. And we always encourage folks to cut later in the season to avoid cutting away some of those flowering plants during the growing season, so that you have the floral resources there throughout the year. Anybody know what this might be? It's actually a natural disturbance that happens here in Maine. This is actually an old, there used to be beaver activities occurring here. The beaver was here, flooded it, it was a wetland, beaver moved on, and when that beaver moved on, the dam was broken with spring rains, and that area just opened up with a lot of flowering plants. And one participant we worked with was interested in keeping this open space for these flowering plants that got established. Next, Kass talked about invasive plants. Here in Piscataquis County, we don't have a whole lot of invasive plants, but in southern Maine, we've seen a lot of encroachment of some of these invasive plants get established. So we utilize some of these practices like brush management, herbaceous weed treatment, to come in and treat those invasive plants, especially if they're really choking the forest understory. Some plants that came to mind: buckthorn, Japanese barberry, Asiatic bittersweet, and then we're starting to see localized areas of garlic mustard as well. Next, forest improvement. This tends to be one of the most popular practices that's utilized here in Maine because it's forest. And there's a lot of things that you could utilize under forest and improvement, different treatments, crop tree release, where you're trying to release certain trees, or you might be changing or altering the stand dynamics to certain tree species. Maybe like those maples that Kass talked about, or it could be some other hardwood trees that provide that pollen and nectar resources. Or it could be just improving the conditions of a mature forest as well. Light thinning activities, or could be pre-commercial thinning as well. Wildflower meadows. So there's a lot of interest, especially with our typical agriculture producers, to create these wildflower meadows. And typically, I don't usually think of them within the woods, but I could see them being utilized maybe in an old log landing. You have kind of the conditions where it's really scarified, you don't have a lot of aggressive vegetation established, and wildflowers could be an option where you create perennial, native, long-lasting wildflowers that are in bloom throughout the year. So you select wildflowers that are in bloom from spring, summer, and fall, so that they provide floral resources throughout the growing season. And these are just examples If not within the forest, it also could be established on the edge of the forest as well. Hedgerow planting, not typically in the woods, but there are places, maybe, again, you have property that has some open areas adjacent to woods, you can establish a hedgerow. And these hedgerows are flowering trees typically. So you could have cherries, willows, or you may have American basswood, some of these really important tree resources. And then moving a little bit towards back into the woods, we do some things called apple tree release. So here you may have relic apple trees that were established a long time ago. And by going in, releasing, doing some pruning activities, thinning around those apple trees, you may increase the blooms, the amount of blooms on those apple trees, and also increase productivity of those apple trees as well. And then we also provide financial assistance on down large wood, so logs that are felled and laid on the ground, and then creation of snag trees as well. And lastly, I touch on a couple other ways that we're working in the woods is brush piles. We have really big ones that can be created or smaller ones. I would imagine your smaller brush piles would do the trick for creating some of these nesting habitats for solitary nesting bees and others. And then also we have solitary bee nests that can be constructed and placed probably outside of the forest, but maybe on the edges of the forest as well. So that's about it. One thing I didn't mention in here, we do work with participants with is tree and shrub establishment. So not only can you create a hedgerow, but also maybe focus on some of those trees and shrubs, or shrubs too, that aren't present in your woodlot. Or you have interest in American chestnut, the Kass product. That's also an opportunity. So yeah, I'll take any questions. Yes.
The plan you talked about earlier, see what type of bees you have and don't have.
Yes.
How much does one of those plans cost roughly?
So there's opportunities for like a pollinator enhancement plan. So this is where you would work with a specialist to write you a very detailed plan about how you can improve habitat conditions on your property. So you'd work with someone called like a technical service provider that would then write up a plan. We also have our planners are familiar with pollinator conservation work, and they can step you through the process without having to go through one of those detailed plans. Or they may work with our future Xerces Society partner biologist or myself to come out, and I can provide you like a trip report that goes over some of the different options.
Where I stand now and what I could do.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So there's different options there. Yep, and when we go and visit the site, we basically evaluate what's there and what opportunities there are to improve conditions for the pollinators and offer, you're the decision maker, but offer some ideas and some assistance in that manner. Yep.
All right, I'm sorry to the folks on Teams, because I just found out you couldn't see Jeremy's presentation, but hopefully you could hear him fine, and we can share it via email with you afterwards. And we will get the next and last, but certainly not least, presenter pulled up here, and we'll go from there.
It wasn't, you couldn't see it on us.
Yeah.
I think it could, because it's on the TV. Yeah, their teams couldn't see it.
I was able to see it.
You were able to see it? Okay, great. Thank you.
Were other people able to see it as well, or?
Yeah, were the folks on Zoom give me like a quick thumbs up? Oh, I see head nods. Okay, all right, thank you. All right, we're gonna pull up the next presentation and we'll get rocking and rolling here.
This is exciting, all this love for the pollinators tonight. I feel like I'm in a great crowd. There's not often that, there's more than one organization really working hard for the pollinators. Usually we're off on our own. We're little solitary bees. Yeah, we're working bees, but we're solitary bees. I have a question. Is this recorded? Because
Yes, it is recorded.
I can't wait to watch it again. I think it's going to be great. I loved Kass's presentation for sure. And yours as well, but I could see yours.
All right, how's everybody, can everybody see that? Okay. I think we're good. All right, so Laurie,
I'm going to just switch it to slideshows and they don't,
yeah,
and maybe I can see my notes.
yeah, go ahead. Okay.
This is risky business. I could mess the whole thing up. Is that better?
Yeah, there we go.
All right, sweet. Okay, well, I can't see my notes, so I do rely on my notes. But I'm Laurie Bowen from the University of Maine Cooperative Extension, and I want to take a few minutes to talk to you about our fairly new pollinator-friendly garden certification program. This is designed for folks that want to be able to do something kind of close to home. They want to feel like they're taking action. And the reason this program was created was to also help educate communities on the importance of pollinators and also how to support pollinators. So we have a staff advisory board, and we also have a volunteer committee that work together. And we also had a lot of folks contribute their opinions on it. We developed this program for homeowners, schools, municipalities, really for anyone to take 4 steps to support pollinators, and then they can apply to have their property, their garden certified as pollinator friendly. And the slide here is actually a photo of the sign that you can display once you are certified as pollinator friendly. I want to talk real quickly about those 4 steps. And I feel really good right now because 2 speakers before me mentioned all these. So we're doing it right. We're doing pretty good with this. So, oh, it's kind of cool to go that way. So as I said, the Pollinator Friendly Garden Certification Program is not just to support pollinators, although that is our main goal. We also want to help educate folks on action that they can take. The program started in 2020, and after a lot of fine tuning, we are up to over 80 certified gardens. The program has expanded to collaborate with UNH, so New Hampshire as well, and we hope that continues to grow. A garden qualifies as pollinator friendly by supplying 4 basic needs for pollinators: food, water, shelter, and safeguarding pollinator habitat. So with food, of course, with this program, we are focusing on the importance of natives. We know how beneficial natives are for our native pollinators. So we do focus on providing a food source for pollinators for what we call all 3 seasons. Early, which is April, May, and June. Mid, which is going to be July and August, and then late, which is going to be our September and October. So we do require that you have a native blooming each season that we need to have the pollinator food available for. Now, even if you're not interested in certifying your garden, we really, really, really want to encourage you to take a look at our webpage. We have so many resources listed on here, so many links. And I feel really good as well because my 2 predecessors, we have links to their information as well. So we're collaborating, we didn't even know it. But please, take a look at any of the resources. The webpage is open to anyone. It's broken down into those 4 different steps. Step 1, of course, as I said, nectar and pollen sources. But it's a great way to take a look at what you have for native plants and also what to avoid. And I'll talk about that again in just a moment. So these are all screenshots of our web page so that you're familiar with it when you go on there. So next is providing water sources for pollinators, because we all know how important that is for the pollinators. You know, not just for hydrating, but also for mating. You know, they need to have that water source available. And there's some great suggestions on there if you don't have a naturally occurring water source. So if you're not lucky enough to live near a lake or a stream. There we go. So as I said, the pollinators need water for many purposes, you know, the drinking, the cooling, the reproduction. And one of the fun things I like about our webpage is we talk a lot about butterfly puddling areas. And some of the photographs are just amazing when you see the butterflies puddling up. Another great resource on there is information on vernal pools, because we don't consider a vernal pool to be a consistent water source. So even though we love vernal pools, so we want to talk about them, they don't meet the requirements in this instance because it's not available all the time for the pollinators. Also, we want to make sure that that water source is within 200 feet of the garden certification area and where you're providing that food for the pollinators. They need to have that resource fairly close by. So shelter. A lot of talk tonight about shelter, but it is super important for the pollinators. What we suggest is getting to know your pollinator. As you start observing the different pollinators coming into your yard, it's going to give you a really good idea of what type of shelter that they need. You know, bumblebees need something different than some of the ground nesting bees that are more solitary. They may prefer the leftover stems and twigs that you can leave in your garden. And that's one of the steps you can take that's super easy. Just leave your garden cleanup until late spring. And you've provided shelter for your pollinators. So overwintering sites, of course, we've got to provide those as well. And as I mentioned, perennial grasses, perennials themselves, you leave those standing and they'll provide shelter throughout the winter and also provide a lot of interest in your garden in the winter as well. Again, we have so many different resources connected to that step as well. So safeguarding pollinator habitat. I want to talk about that real quickly. We've broken it down into action steps. So it's a multi-step approach. Number one, we talk about eliminating pesticide use, but I want to just clarify, we're talking about pesticide use in a particular garden area. We support the prudent and correct use of pesticides, but because in this situation, we are encouraging creating your own little habitat area. For this instance, we're saying that you must agree not to use pesticides in that area. We do also request that you remove invasive plants. This is a big one for us, and we do put a lot of information out there for this. We need to remove those invasive plants to protect our native plant communities. We have so many resources on that as well. We do want to encourage you, if you do remove the invasive plants, though, to be sure to come in and replace them with natives as quickly as possible, because those invasives can come right back and re-inhabit that area that you just went through a great deal of trouble to clear out. So our additional conservation practices also are very easy, and things that we recommend all the time anyway, like soil tests. Before you apply any fertilizers or anything like that, if you do a soil test, it will save you money probably in the long run, as well as a lot of work. Find out what your soil needs before applying anything. Things like setting your mower blade at 3 inches or leaving your leaves behind, composting kitchen scraps. All of these are additional conservation practices that you can do that will help the pollinators and the other wildlife that you're planting your gardens for. Let's see, there's another one that I'd like to talk about here. Watering plants only when necessary. So when we talk about encouraging you to have those native plants, that's one of the bonuses. Native plants, once they're established, are adapted to this habitat and this ecosystem. So they're not going to be quite as high maintenance as some of your other plants. Okay. Oh, there we go. So real quickly, I'm just gonna wind things up here, but I wanted to show you some photos of some of our certified gardens, just so that you'll see how diverse they are. Everyone has a different idea of what a beautiful pollinator garden is going to look like. So they can be very wild, but then again, we can still do a very manicured. We can return wild areas and just let them go wild. But as I said, everyone has a different idea, but they're all meeting that same criteria of supplying native plants, a water source, shelter, and safeguarding the habitat. The beautiful and different approaches to pollinator gardens. This, actually, I'm going to back up real quick. This one is actually in a parking area, and it's the median between where the cars park. So I think that's a great use of space. Does anyone have any questions? I'm not sure. I can't really tell if you're online, but yeah, all different approaches. Some of these are just being converted, where the natives are being added. We don't ask you, unless it's invasive, we don't ask you to remove any of the plants that you already have, because there are a lot of non-natives that can contribute as well, but we're just asking you to make sure that you do have the native resources on there. So if you have any questions or interest in the program, feel free to reach out to us. If you just put in your search engine, Maine pollinator friendly will pop up. And I don't know how to make a presentation go away. I will write that for you. Thank you. Yeah.
So I'll just mention that NRCS is moving into urban landscapes.
Awesome.
Into the future. So we're not just working with your typical woodlot owner or your typical crop producer. So you'll see us doing more initiatives within urban landscapes. So if there isn't financial assistance to help with maybe your efforts, then your local NRCS office can help you out. Help those privately 100%.
Yeah, and that's awesome. And as you're going through the webpage, you're going to see us refer to a lot of NRCS publications and resources too. That's another great resource to check out too.
So we will take a minute and see if anyone has any questions for any of our presenters. And looks like Linda, go ahead and unmute yourself. It looks like, and you can ask your question.
I have a question about plants for the larval stage of some of the pollinators. I can find a lot of information about, for nectar and pollen, but it's about what plants to help for the larval stage. Thank you.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, Laurie's gonna go ahead and jump in on that, Linda, and then if Kass and Jeremy want to add to it, so go ahead.
So for the kind of cheat sheet kind of resource, if you go to our website and you download the application, what we have done is we have check boxes actually when you are checking off the native plant resources. And what we did was we put an H by every plant that's a larval host plant, because we want to make sure you have those as well. But this is kind of like a real quick cheat sheet if you're looking for some fast resources to get you started. And then I'm sure you all have more resources.
All right, go ahead.
Sorry. I think that sounds amazing. And then the only other thing is maybe just like helpful, maybe you know this, but for folks who don't, with butterflies, we're often thinking about what the caterpillar eats. And then separately, there are plants that the butterfly adult is nectaring on. Whereas for solitary bees and bees in general, when that bee is collecting pollen on a flower, it's pretty much taking all of it back to feed larvae at that point. So even though you're seeing the adult on the flower, it's taking the pollen home to feed the larvae. And adult bees don't need to eat a ton of pollen, but we think they usually will just take a snack on the same flower that they were already on at the end after they've finished making a pollen ball. So hopefully that's useful extra info.
Awesome. Thank you. So I don't see any more questions on Teams. Does anyone here have any questions? Oh, do we have a raised hand? Darren, are you, Darren, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, it's a question for Jeremy, I think would be the best one to answer it is, it's about cost share funding through EQIP. And I was wondering, I've seen information about, the initiative for the pollinators. And what I'm wondering is it a separate batch of money separate from the regular EQIP? And is the cost share rates the same for like the forest stand improvement? And how does a landowner apply for that funding? And how do they, does the TSP have to justify the pollinator benefit from this, or how does that work as far as to be eligible for that funding?
Yeah, there is a separate account here in Maine that we set aside for the New England Pollinator Partnership. So there is that, but also the local field offices may also have a fund pool within their offices that may provide funding as well. So if you're working, are you a TSP?
Yes.
You are, okay. Yeah, you might be able to mention to the clients you work with that they can request to utilize any PP fund pool, or at least request their applications to be assessed and ranked within a fund pool that they could get funding for the pollinator practices.
Okay, good. So when the landowner submits an application for forest stand improvement, it might be better, for them to well, I'm just wondering how they put on their application. So just work with the District of Conservation to say that there's pollinator benefits to here, so we'd like to be able to apply under both pools of money, or do you have to dedicate the application into one set of money each application?
Yes, I would assume that the office would put that application compete within the two different separate fund pools within the local office, and then also at the state office level as well. So there would be likely two options, and the application would compete within both of those fund pools.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
You bet.
Linda, did you have another question, or was your hand still raised? I just wanted to make sure. Yeah. Good. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Anything from this group? All right, well, I will wrap up. We're at 7:30, which is awesome because I think that was our goal. And thank you to everyone who participated in our first ever hybrid meeting. I'm feeling very accomplished. And thank you, of course, to our awesome presenters. So much information was shared tonight. I will have a recording available on the district YouTube channel. I can share with this group afterwards. And if anybody wants any of the presentations, I can email them to anyone. So you can just reply to the email you got from me this morning and I can get that information out to you. And if we're good, I wish everybody a wonderful evening and thank you again for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad
Thank you so much.
projects and working on.
Thank you.
One, of course, management plan, so, but on the other
John.
4 of them are property releases.
Thank you.